You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to Raincoast Radio's first series of Wolves and Women. I'm Chelsea Greer, Director of Raincoast Wolf Conservation Program, and your host for this series of conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. Thank you all so much for your amazing support of the show so far. We've really enjoyed seeing your responses and reactions come through, and if you're enjoying what you're hearing, we'd love it if you could leave a rating or a review wherever you're listening. And hey, if you're liking the show, don't forget to share it with others. Today, I am very excited to be joined by wildlife scientist and canid specialist, Shelley Alexander.
Welcome, Shelley. Would you be able to introduce yourself to our audience?
I'm a professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Calgary. I have about 30 years of experience with wild canids, mostly in the area of conflict mitigation, but a fairly diverse background in behavior, in ecology, and into human dimensions as well. And I've specialized for the last 15 years in coyotes. And I also have experience with wolves and coyotes in captivity.
Fun fact, Shelley was my supervisor for my master's research. So it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And you said you've been working with canid species, so coyotes, wolves, painted dogs. I'm sure we'll talk about that later, for over 30 years. Can you tell me a bit about what your early experiences or background were that might have led you to start studying these animals?
I always had an affinity for dogs. One of the things I think that was probably formative for me ending up studying animals, having wanted to study them. You know, when you're doing the career aptitude tests in high school, trying to figure out what you want to do, I had wanted to do zoology, but never ended up directly in that till later. One of the things I think that was really formative was we traveled a lot. So as a kid, we were traveling overseas and living overseas and constantly moving. And it's challenging as a kid in those environments because you never really get settled down, and there's often having to recreate yourself or who you are. But animals always seemed to be the point where I would gravitate to because they were easy, they understood. There was the complication of having to retell the story or explain who you were. And so in a world where things are constantly changing, they were sort of a source of solace. Lots of people had dogs, and so wherever we were, I would usually gravitate to the dog. I wanted to pursue wildlife. I thought that would be a cool job. When they did the aptitude test back then, everybody would say, you're not going to get a job doing that. So I sort of shifted gears. I would say the next time I had really a formative moment was in Vancouver, Granville Island. And there was a guy down there with a captive wolf. He was trying to raise money to save wolves. While I was in my university degree, I was working in Jasper as a boat driver on Moline Lake and a naturalist, and I was actually in a degree in commerce at that point in time. I realized that I really preferred the naturalist route, so I wanted to figure out how I could help. He just sat me down in the back room. For whatever reason, he picked a film and he said, you should watch this. And it was called, I think, Death of a Legend. It was this horribly traumatic film about the plight of wolves in North America, and the end scenes were these people chasing down the wolf in the snow on a snowmobile and then shooting it in the head with a handgun.
So why do you think he showed you that video? Was it to deter you from studying wolves or to show you, I guess, the reality of the plight of wolves?
Once you've done this stuff for a while, part of it is you become numb to the violence. Maybe he didn't even remember the end of it, or maybe it's part of the story. I believe that the film was shown to me because it was impactful, and wolves were just returning to Jasper and Banff. And so it might have just been timely as well. I can't seem to find that film online. I think it was more about this is an important species that needs help. And the film was designed specifically to be, emotional and evocative. It stuck. I finished my commerce degree because I was like, I'm not going to keep jumping around in degrees. I had started in engineering and then I switched to commerce. So I wanted to finish that. And then I moved to the mountains right away to Banff. And for the first year I was there, I was helping at Sunshine Ski Hill doing artwork, things like that for their interp, just volunteer. One of the speakers that came in was Paul Paquette, because he had just shown up to do the wolf research. And I didn't know him, but My friend who was working with the interpreters came home and said, this guy's amazing and he's doing wolf research and you've always wanted to do wolf stuff. I called Paul and asked if I could volunteer because I was working at the Banff Center at the time. They had had an incident with a volunteer, and so it was just they weren't having any volunteers. So he said, sorry, can't do it, but try back another time. A year later, I reached out again. I said, I don't know if you remember me. He said, yeah, of course. So I started that year volunteering. Got trained up with him. I went to the backcountry a couple of times and learned how to do the telemetry. So I worked with Paul for a while in the field, and then we had more team come on, and he put me into a position of scheduling the field work and doing the backtracking and that, and reporting to him, and it grew from there.
Yeah, can you tell us a bit more about this study that Paul was leading and also how radio telemetry was being used to track wolves at the time?
So they started to return, I believe it was in the 80s. There was 1 or 2 wolves. They were recolonizing by that point, but they were still in flux. So the wolves were still figuring out where they were going to set up their territories. Interestingly, later when they looked, Paul gave me some historic documents to go through and summarize. And the dens that they were using were the same ones from like 50 years before. So it was really interesting to see that they moved down those same corridors and then started to reoccupy. But by the time I was there, it was still in flux when I arrived. So the study had just started a year before, I think, the formal study that Paul was brought in to do. And so at that time, VHF radio collars had been developed and deployed. It was fairly common technology at that point in time. You had to drive and listen with the receiver for a beep, waiting with these headphones on, this white noise in the background. And everybody would always say, you got to make sure you keep that white noise down because it makes you go daft. Over time, you start to desensitize it. So you're turning it up because you start hearing phantom beeps and stuff. And so you're turning it up and up and up and you listen for the beep. Then when you hear the beep, you get out, boop, boop, boop. There's this gain that's on there. The closer you get to it, the louder the sound gets. You might hear it faintly, and it could broadcast on a straight plane up to about 60 kilometers away, but in the mountains, it's fairly restricted, right, to where you're going to hear it. And then you stop and you get out, and you had your receiver was set to the code like a radio station on that collar. You knew who you had, and then you would just triangulate. So you would use the antenna and you run the antenna to the outer limits of where the sound starts to decline to where it's gone. And those were your endpoints on each side. And then the center of that would be the direction that you would take a bearing and you would plot that bearing on a map. And then you would get in your vehicle and you would drive further. It becomes a bit of an art because you would figure out how the landscape might be bouncing the signal or that, and then you would find a point where you could triangulate back optimally at a 45-degree angle, somewhere between about 20 and 45 degrees. And so then you would get out, do the same thing all over again, and you get another bearing. You'd use your map to figure out where you were, because we didn't have GPS at the time. So you use the map to figure out where you were on the road, and then you would take the bearing, and then you use your compass on that map to draw that line. Sometimes you could get it at 2 points, 2 bearings, but usually you had to take 3. And then you'd have a pretty good confidence that where you put that dot on the map, where those 3 lines intersected, that's where the wolf was. And so then you would take that point, write it down on the data sheet and everything else, including all your bearings and everything, and then carry on and try to find the next one. That was the point of finding the location of them. About every month, Paul would do 24 hours of that, where he would go all around the clock in order to equalize bias that you might get. It was pretty involved at the time. Then we also moved to the first GPS radio collars, satellite radio collars. I think it was around, but the first one that wore the satellite collar that I remember there would have been Pluie.
Yeah, could you share more about the shift to using satellite collars and how that changed the type of data you were able to collect?
So the radio collars, they did a couple of really important things, beyond being able to track where they were. The radio collars allowed Paul to take that data and determine the home range sizes. There were software systems available at the time, but it was all coding to do that work. What it did was it transformed the understanding of the home ranges of these wolves coming back in and how big the home ranges were in the Rockies, because most of the wolf studies had been done in the eastern U.S. And so those home ranges were much smaller and compact. Those home ranges were up to 3,000 square kilometers. So what that meant was, because people didn't know in the mountains how large these home ranges were, they were overestimating the number of wolves, because you might see black wolf in Banff, and then it might show up 2 days later in the Columbia Valley or something like that. That's a travel distance they could do in 2 days, but those would be counted as independent wolves. And so it really changed an understanding of the density that was actually there, and it's very different. The radio collars also helped us see that there was this interpack exchange going on. And in particular, certain individual wolves were going back and forth between families and packs of wolves that were in very different areas. That was unreported because there was at that point in time this understanding that these wolf home ranges were very well defended, and any stranger that came in, and then they were set. Who was there was who was there. Occasionally another animal might be accepted, but those territories were defended, and the breeding pair was the breeding pair. This changed everything because there was these individuals who were in flux. Louis, the one with the satellite color, was one of those. I believe it was a wolf named Midnight that preceded me. That wolf was actually going back and forth between two families and behaving in those two families as the dominant male, the breeding male. It blew the common idea about how wolves behave and defend territories, upended that. Some of that may have had to do with the fact they were recolonizing. Some of it may be behavioral, just culturally different. The collars are what allowed that. So the radio collars had a really important role in changing our understanding. And so at that point, radio collars were put on with leg hold traps. One of the ethical considerations of using leg hold traps to trap anything is that there can be injuries and there can be death in non-target species. Things are done to augment the traps to minimize the chances of that happening, but there's always these risks, and there's risk of the animal injuring itself. At that time, what we were learning about it was perceived to be worth the cost of the occasional individual being harmed, or in some cases, animal bycatch dying, or in some cases, other animals being severely maimed in the trap and then having to be put down.
Yeah, it's really so important to consider these potential risks to the animals, as you said, both target and non-target, and also how our actions, whether well-intended or not, impact the well-being of these individuals. And I really want to come back to this when we talk about how these experiences and advancements in non-invasive methods have, shaped the way that you do your work now. But first, I want to ask you about Pluie the wolf, as you've mentioned her a few times now. Pluie the wolf has become, the significant part of wildlife conservation history in Canada, and I'm sure in the US as well, based on her journey. Can you tell us a little bit more about her and your role in tracking her?
I was working for Paul in Banff. Graham Neal was brought in as the trapper. So Diane Boyd had been our trapper earlier, and then Graham Neal came in to do the trapping. And that summer, I stayed home to look after all their dogs that day, and they caught Pluie that day, and she was outfitted with the satellite collar. Graham took me down there and showed me the tracks and where he'd set the traps, and then one of her tracks was there, and so we did a track cast. It's very funny because at the time, you have no clue where that's going to go. And suddenly, like now, 30 years later, that track is like, people start shaking and quivering when they see the track, when they go to try to touch it. She's become so legendary. Graham also gave me some of the belly hair from her because he had taken a small bit of belly hair. I still have that. The contract ran out in Banff, and I was hired part-time in Kananaskis country. That became my study animal when I was down there. That involved the same thing, following on the roads, but then she would vanish. Occasionally we would fly. I think the last time I had flown, we got the signal like way down south, way down south Kananaskis, so getting towards, heading down towards the border. And then she would vanish, and then she would show up. She would vanish for a week, 2 weeks, something like that, and then she would show up again. I didn't work with her for very long before I shifted into doing my master's. So about a year. And then her satellite data started to come in. And her satellite collar data showed her going all the way down into Idaho, across to Spokane. And at that point, research was also going on. Like Diane was doing research down, and others were doing research down just across the border in the United States. And those wolves started popping across the border. Pluie solidified that these long-range movements were happening for whatever purpose. But that meant that wolves were potentially going to continue to recolonize into the areas that they had been completely exterminated from in the United States because they were endangered at the time and extinct in most, in the areas they were reintroduced to. People were just blown away by the distances she was traveling. She was in the process of doing that, captured consorting with, was around 5 different wolf families and crossing 16 different jurisdictions. She would go from being a protected animal in either in a national park, in the provincial parks, and then she would roam out into an area where she was completely unprotected and shot on sight in, say, in the foothills. And then she would cross into BC, into another management jurisdiction. That changed the whole framework for how we understood how these large carnivores used the landscape. And at that time, World Wildlife Fund was gathering all this information on wolves, wolverine, and other species, and it became clear that there had to be large intact conservation areas. And so World Wildlife Fund at that point, I believe it was 93, was a document came out called the Carnivore Conservation Areas, defining these large conservation areas that would go right across border. And then, of course, from there, the US side of that was there needed to be legislation to deal with these animals. There was a recognition they were going to get to Yellowstone at some point in time. And that's where the story of the reintroduction begins. They returned to Canada to take the wolves from Jasper down to Yellowstone for the reintroduction. That set off a huge chain of events, obviously. Pluie was featured in an episode of The West Wing. It used to be a show that was on TV because it involved people who were field people having to go to DC and work with politicians to change the legislation and that. So people who were engaged in that reintroduction. We held a conference in Banff back then. That was one of my jobs for Paul and Monty Hummel with World Wildlife Fund. Arlen Hackman was to bring people together on this particular issue of the large carnivores. And from then, yes, Pluie became the symbol, and what she represented became the symbol and sort of the guiding light around the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. In concert with what was happening, the ideas I think that had been put forward by World Wildlife Fund grew into something bigger.
I want to go back to your early days with Paul, because I know that work got a lot of media coverage, including this article that was featured in Canadian Geographic in the November-December 1992 edition called The Wolfman. I believe the Wolfman is Paul Paquette. Can you talk a little bit about that article and the influence it had on the next generation of female researchers?
It's funny because I didn't find out about this till quite a bit later. Paul was very good at pushing the media towards a little more focus on the people who were working, under him in particular. Well, I think I was the only female at the time. I was in the field and knew where everything was going on. And so I got to go out with the Canadian Geographic people and just take them out and see what we could find. And it was fairly fortunate that we did the article. It's quite funny to go back and read it. We did find a kill that day and the wolves were on it. So that was really interesting. The article came out and it's quite dramatic, right? Paul in his purple shirt looking out with his telemetry gear over the Bow Valley. There was a lot of media attention going on that particular article. It was fun to be involved. I was a bit overwhelmed when I flipped it open and there was me across 2 pages. That wasn't something I was expecting. So that was fun. For some people in my life who were questioning what I was doing with my time, and that sort of profile legitimized what I was doing to some degree. When I was in my PhD, I had this young guy working for me, and he had moved into one of the staff accommodations where a bunch of the women who were now doing field work at that point in time had been living. All of a sudden, he shows up at work one day and he slaps this magazine down in front of me. He goes, "What is this?" Right? Like, it was funny. I said, "Well, where'd you find that?" He goes, "Well, it was in the so-and-so's closet. They'd been in there before." And I thought, oh, that's funny. Anyway, so then I was at this big event and somebody was talking about giving a toast and talking about how this woman and her friends had all seen this article in Canadian Geographic. And they were biology students or geography students, and they had decided if a woman could do that's what they wanted to do. And there was evidence that a woman was doing it, and what a cool place to go and do that kind of work. And they moved. They just picked up and moved west, connected with Paul, but then the project was transferred over. All of those women are now in leadership positions in wildlife conservation in the region. So whether it's senior park ecologist or the executive director of a conservation organization or wardens in charge of human wildlife conflict, which really brought a different lens onto how the work is done. I think that's been an important contributing factor in changing the demographic of who does this kind of work and who can do this kind of work. Because by virtue of being in the field, I took a chance to go do it because I had to make a choice to do something that wasn't going to pay very much, and a lot of it for free. And so you take a chance to go and do it. But I think at the end, it's what you've got to gain in terms of all the experiences. One of the things is it encouraged women to come and do that work in a male-dominated field, very male-dominated field. Then that's a pretty good outcome.
Kind of an unexpected inspiration to others. And yeah, that real benefit of, having women come into the field, and I think just having the mix of perspectives. Men bring a different perspective, women do, just all of us as individuals with our various life histories. And that all kind of shapes how we approach a lot of this research and how we understand animals as well. Working with wolves and in the field of wildlife management was and is a very male-dominated field. What were some of the biggest challenges and obstacles that you faced as a woman at that time?
Just being taken seriously was the main thing, and as more women showed up and were doing the work, that was less of an issue, but a lot of sexual harassment. I'll give you an example where somebody who had been working with me was of Japanese descent, but born in Canada, Canadian. His family had been here probably more generations than most, considered visible minority, right, at that point in time. Got a job in the warden office. He'd been working for me and then got a job. And when I went in and I said, "That's so awesome, he got the job," the response from the manager was, "Lucky him, makes life almost as easy as being a woman." Comments about my body. You're there and you're talking about something serious, and then there would be some comment about your physical appearance. A lack of comprehension that you were actually doing anything other than following the so-called term that was used was the silverbacks. Paul was a silverback, he was the Canadian wolfman. There were only a few people who were at that level who were the big wolf people. They were all men, but women who were hanging around were sort of perceived to simply be there, not there for anything really serious other than to affiliate with that person. I think at the time I wasn't as aware. I was so used to it everywhere. It was worse there, but I was used to those kinds of things happening. I would just slough it off until one day Graham Neal pulled me aside and said, "You don't let people talk to you like that."
We're all so different. And myself, I despise confrontation. Think about in those days, just needing to confront people so that they wouldn't treat you a certain way or that they'd see you as an equal it's a lot to ask of some people. It's something that I'm so thankful that women like you have paved the way so that we can do the work, and the work is seen as a contribution to research and not just blinded by other things.
You bring your own mechanism to how you deal with that. I was an avoidant sort of person, laugh it off. But it took somebody saying that to me. But then how you respond to that, everybody responds differently, because if you don't have the lessons to figure that out, you can become harder, get a tougher exterior, become more blunt. It shapes, I think, how you continue to engage over time, whatever your defensive mechanism is to that.
After your job with Paul, where did your career lead you from there? Was that when you started working in captivity?
It was the first year I worked for Paul. I had this dream, I guess probably forever, of being close to those animals and what would it be like in captivity and learning about them and their behavior. And in the wild, they're mostly just a beep, right? You don't see them very often. You don't go close to them on purpose. Just this idea of being able to learn the behavior and look after them. That was, I think, in 91. It was when I first started with Paul. I had asked if he could help me get to work with someone in captivity, and he said he knew Jenny Ryan outside Halifax. So I contacted her. Paul was really good at this stuff. He's like, you have to do the contacting. I'm not going to do it for you. So I contacted, and she was like, "No, thanks, though." It's just like everybody, volunteers can be a lot of work and sometimes not much return. I think I told Paul I was really disappointed, and he says, "Well, you try her again." And I did. So he'd had a conversation with her that I was very, very good at what I did. And so it was actually just for a summer living in the enclosure. I think it was a family of 13 there. And then there were several other satellite wolves that had been sort of taken out of the family to keep the number from getting too big. The area itself wasn't really large. It was the only in-den facility where the studies were done in the den. This was early on, at the same time I was doing the field work. It was formative. I was in charge of feeding and filming the wolves during feeding time. And Jenny, she was really the person that had laid down this understanding of the wolf language and dominance within the family and the different individual members and their roles in the family and how they engage with the pups and everything else. And then, of course, the in-den thing, like how does the language develop, whether that's sound and ears, anything like that. Back then, the video technology was you had to haul in car batteries. I think this was formative in the skill building, how I learned to cope with challenging situations later in my life, because you had to put these 4 big car batteries into a wheelbarrow and you had to change the batteries out in the den for, I think it was 3 or 4 times a day. And so all night, right? So because the den taping had to go on all night, and these cameras were inside the den, concealed, but focusing in on the chamber with her pups, right? So you had to go in the back of the den and put this in. But to get there, you had to go through these series of gates. And Jenny taught me all the behaviors around, it was a slow introduction with her first, and learning how to act around these animals so as not to alarm them or create a situation where you might get in an accident. I would push this big wheelbarrow with the 4 batteries in it with my rubber boots on. The alpha, the time called them alpha beta, but the alpha male was following right behind. So as soon as I would come in that gate, I had to go several hundred meters with this thing, walking really slowly, and with the breeding male behind me going like just this low growl. And so, everything in your body you have to fight not to run. There were 3 coyote pups that had been orphaned. 3 of the litter went to the Shubenacadie Zoo and 3 came to us. That became one of my main jobs, was filming play development in these puppies and being their surrogate mother. And then I got involved that same summer with going and talking to livestock owners, sheep herders, about their different techniques they were using to deter predation by coyotes. As doors opened, it would just be like, yeah, that sounds really cool. I got to do necropsying of the coyotes. So I learned things I had never learned in school. I was learning all this stuff in the field on the fly, right? What does an animal look like inside? I didn't do anatomy classes and such. Struck, of course, as somebody from the outside, as how similar they were to us, right? I was like, oh, they're just like us. They just sort of rearranged, right? And Jenny also was very spiritual about the animals. So I had this opportunity, as I say, these doors opened. I had all these experiences and learned all this stuff that wasn't directly applicable to what I was doing in the field at the time. Again, all this cool knowledge. In the field, I was backtracking in the snow. I was doing the radio telemetry. Jenny was also very spiritual about the animals. And so I learned there, as well as working with Paul, but an appreciation for these animals in spirit as unique beings. So I think that laid down some formative groundwork for what will come back later. All of that at the time didn't seem like it was highly relevant to what I was doing in the field. But wow, did it ever come back 25 years later? It was like that specific constellation of skills was so unique, and unique probably amongst North Americans. Like there'd be a handful of people, or maybe dozens now, who would have that constellation of experience to draw it back and bring it to the wild to solve a conflict problem. I sometimes tell that story because you never know which one of these events, whether it's the film in Jasper or caring for coyote puppies in Nova Scotia, that just seemed like a really cool add-on to everything I was doing. Those might be extremely formative moments.
I want to talk a little bit about GIS. And I guess, could you start by explaining what GIS is in kind of the most simple, condensed form?
After I finished with working with Paul's project on the Rocky Mountain Wolves wound down, but I stayed working in the field, and then I went back and did my master's. And at that time, I learned about using GIS, or geographic information systems, for mapping, for land use planning and all that. But my project that I did there was for habitat modeling, learning how to use the radio telemetry data that we collected with geographic information systems to understand how wildlife select, or how wolves selected for certain places and avoided certain places. A geographic information system is a computer system for storing maps of a variety of different types. They're gathered together from, like I say, they could be a digital topographic map, a road map. It's housed within the geographic information system. And the geographic information system is different than just mapping because it allows you to explore the relationships between those things. So for example, how many roads are within 1 kilometer of a wolf den site. I was very early on in that, and I first just got to work doing a bit of the tech support work for Paul on another project, a wildlife corridor project in Canmore. And then I started working on GIS with Alberta Parks. I was taking a course at the time, and then I became their GIS sort of support person in the office, creating a lot of the base maps that we would use for analysis for habitat planning and that. Where that went from there was when I went back to do my graduate degree, that became the focus of my graduate degree because GIS it had been around for quite a while, but it was relatively in its infancy in the wildlife sort of domain, in the conservation domain. There was an opportunity there to start to use the geographic information systems to understand where do wolves prefer to be, what kinds of things create disturbance, even just exploring the limits of the technology. And so I really was in the right place at the right time, but also willing to explore that, interested in it, right? So this opportunity presented itself and I said, yeah, that's kind of cool. It takes me out of the field, but this is another level, right, of what do you do with that data? And technology was just very cool. So that's how I ended up in that, doing habitat modeling, and it went from one project to another. Wolves were always featured in it.
And one of those projects, or I feel like it was probably multiple big projects, was on the coastal wolves of British Columbia. Remember you saying that was a huge GIS undertaking. You started using it as a new and emerging tool. And I mean, looking at the coastal wolf stuff and now how you're using it now, how it's really transformed wildlife research. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The Coastal Wolf Project, Paul brought me on. That was one of my first projects as a professor. He brought me in to coordinate the spatial analysis component of the Raincoast Wolf Project. Again, at the time, it's not like it is now where people have realized there need to be repositories or there's free access to data. Back then, there was a lot of proprietary data. Where you got what data wasn't clear. And so there was a lot of legwork, like fly out there to the island and start going to Department of Fisheries and Oceans. All of these different agencies who were very separate at what they were doing. Was it fish escapement rates? That's one place. Was it tides and currents? That was another place. Was it forestry? That was another, office. And so pulling all that together was a lot of work. And we pulled it together for the whole of the BC coast. Some of the data was just strictly unattainable because of the costs associated with it. One of the maps alone was going to be $250,000 for that data for that whole area. And then somehow some nonprofit group got it. The other challenge with this is when you're consolidating all of this data together, much of it occurs at like a 70 to 70 square kilometer size. And so everything has to be stitched together. And there's just all sorts of corrections that have to be done to every one of those maps before they get stuck together. So it was a massive undertaking just to get the base data together. I oversaw 3 or 4 students that did analyses, went to the coast, worked on the Coastal Wolf Project. 3 women who worked with that data, looked at different things like why do wolves select the islands they do? What's driving the selection of a particular island? So this was going back and borrowing from things early theory like island biogeography theory and trying to understand what would make an island appealing to a wolf to swim to, but also then to go and live at and forage there. Testing, did those island biogeography theory, did that theory hold up? But what else might be impacting or affecting their presence, persistence on those islands? And at the time, they weren't considered in the management plans at all. One of the key factors that came out, island size was important, so obviously. So the island biogeography held up, which was really great. So it's the bigger the island, the more likely they're going to be there. These are intuitive things. The closer it is to another island, the more likely wolves are going to be there. The distance to the mainland, the more likely they're going to be there. The only other thing of 30 different variables that we looked at included things like prey richness, species diversity of salmon, topographic complexity, deer presence, all those kinds of things. In the top models, the only other thing that showed up was percent of logging. That gave a fairly clear picture of the impacts that logging would have on the persistence of that species in that landscape. And as a focal species, umbrella species, keystone species in that ecosystem, it's a critical thing if we don't manage how that landscape is being denuded. Leave some of it at least intact, right, as much as possible. Not just from a scientific standpoint, but from that applied management standpoint. The Celtic Nation had been very involved in that, in the surveys and driving those surveys.
Yes, and the Celtic, I just want to say, have really been leaders when it comes to applied management and, supporting evidence-based management practices in their territory that, foster positive outcomes, not only for people, but also for wildlife. There's a growing recognition that, different animals perceive the world in unique ways. For example, we know that the world appears very different to a wolf or a coyote than to a human, especially when considering their heightened sense of smell or other senses that are far more developed than ours. And, this is increasingly being integrated into scientific research and is an important consideration in how we approach how we study these animals. And, you've talked about your experiences with radio collaring and telemetry, and there's been a lot of progression and advancement in research techniques since then. And I know that, things like snow tracking and camera traps have played a big role in your work. Can you speak to how these new methods, these experiences have affected how you approach studying canid species, and also how we define good habitat for these animals?
The traditional models, when we're looking from above and we're doing habitat conservation, most of those maps that we make are made from satellite data or other data, remotely sensed data that are collected from above. So when we look at, is this area intact? It's what we can see from above. The notion of model of habitat and good habitat, when we look at it that way, can break down because it's the dynamics of what's happening under that canopy that might be driving whether the animals can live there or not. From above, it might look like an intact forest. From underneath, there's people in there trapping and killing them all the time. So it's not truly habitat. So there's sort of this qualification that isn't there. The other probably more relevant part for where my work has gone is into how do individual animals perceive that landscape? What does that change of that landscape mean to them? What does it mean to them to be faced with chronic stressors in that environment? When you talk about it as a wildlife scientist, which I am, there's a lot of pushback remaining in terms of thinking about animals as being sentient and having these emotional responses to landscapes or perceptive responses to landscape or to habitat. I think, though, that it's probably as critical as having the habitat is understanding how they perceive and operate in that habitat, and what is that emotional fabric or that lived experience fabric in that forest or on that landscape. When you talk about those things, though, many people are still uncomfortable with the notion of animals having a lived experience. You can easily get labeled as being emotional and not really scientific and not objective. Yet these things that we are looking at are actually objectively measured when we do things like animal welfare science, or we do welfare looking at experiences of animals that are closest to us in response to pain, and what are the signals of pain, and reading your own pet and knowing that it appears to be suffering in some way, right? Like, these are common day things, plus we have a science around it. It's there, it's just not accepted within that definition. And so I think this has been a missing part of our understanding of what is habitat and what is useful habitat. And then when we alter these landscapes, what happens? What's the consequence of all of this stress, loss? If you go back to my first surprise at finding that the body of the inside of the coyote was just like us, just a little bit differently organized. And you realize they have a mind and they have these abilities. And we use the same metrics when we're trying to understand the development of a child mind. We even use the way that a social carnivore's mind and behavior helps us understand human development. That's the evidence, that's the benchmark that we need to be looking at, saying, okay, we have this analog that they actually are looking at the world. They can be looking at the world in somewhat similar way. Their experiences, if it's in response to loss or stress, if they're biologically wired, physically wired the same way we are, and we use them as an analog for how humans develop socially and how thinking develops, interactions develop, then why can't we extend the notion of what would happen to a human put in that situation back to them? Paul and I and a few others in our closer circle talk about what's the closest analog to that in terms of human experience. Well, humans experiencing war, humans experiencing homelessness. What would happen to us as a person if we experienced those things? There's stress, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, changes in behavior that are associated with those things. I bring that back to, if those things are happening and that experience of life is altered so negatively, then how do we start to conceive of habitat differently? And how do we start to articulate that differently, and how do we start to build management plans, say, that respond to that? And that stuff all really falls within this whole newer discipline of compassionate conservation. We're extending our compassion footprint to other species. But the bottom line is, There's so many similarities. And if we are willing to use those similarities to describe and understand human behavior, why are we not allowed to take that lens back and apply that to them?
So there's really a big focus on individuals. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that as well, because in BC and in Alberta, where you are, and across North America, thousands of wolves and coyotes are killed legally and illegally, trapped, killed. I always remember that specific number that you use in presentations, where it's an estimated 500,000 coyotes are killed every year in the US, which is 1 per minute. So I wonder if you could speak to the implications of indiscriminately removing individuals from their pack or family groups.
So one of the things that I didn't mention in that is exactly what you're saying, is each of these animals has their own perceptive landscape. Each of these species has their own perception of how the world is organized and whatever their senses are. But then there are individual differences within that species. So one coyote or wolf may perceive the landscape differently. So for example, in the wolf case in Banff National Park, we had wolves that the early highway was mitigated with fencing and a small crossing structure underneath the highway. And the wolves were using it. This is the very first twinning that happened. With the death of the alpha animal, the dominant animal in that family, they no longer would cross. So different individuals have different tolerances for these things. And it's recognizing what Aristotle calls telos. Telos refers really to your purpose in this life. Every single thing has a telos, this destination that it's trying to get to, whether it's an oak tree growing or whether it's the coyote. And within that, they have their own range of experiences of what that looks like. When I think about extending compassion to these animals, I think about, from a management perspective, saying, okay, how do we allow this species to live and realize its telos, its best form of itself? That's kind of where my thinking has gone on this. Of it's not humans versus animals or anything like that. It's looking at how do we allow this animal to express itself and live its life the best of its species that it can be within that. How do we help it maintain that while realizing there's this negotiation going on with us in that landscape too? Looking at the camera trap data, I've been influenced by other people's work now, of course, in around social intelligence and wolves. What's going on for these animals? What can I measure? What are the signs, the physical expressions of different emotions that I'm seeing in the cameras? I use cameras to look at who's there, when they're there, what kinds of behaviors they're engaged in. Chelsea, to your work with the direct observation of the elephants, cataloging those different activities that they do and how much time do they spend. The new work looks at how does the environment that they're in, whether it's rural and less disturbed or peri-urban, or there's sort of a mixture of development levels and human impacts, and then central urban. How do those environments relate to the kinds of behaviors that we're seeing and how much time they can spend in their natural behaviors? So natural behaviors meaning like obviously eating and all that, but I'm talking about the interpersonal behaviors that are important for social development, related probably to potential to get involved in conflict with humans later. Things like how much time do they spend in play versus how much time does an adult spend in vigilance versus caring and nurturing and grooming, because those things we know have ramifications through multiple generations. When we look at other animals, we know that the amount of time spent grooming can actually affect that animal's social status, that animal's ability to relate, its survival odds, its likelihood of engaging in those behaviors towards its own offspring. And so there's epigenetic consequences. I can't measure with the data I have, but I'm looking at sort of laying down that framework of what are those impacts of these different landscapes on those key things that are important to social development. What is the evidence in the imagery and the physical stances and the facial expressions and the behaviors that tell me about the emotions those animals may be experiencing, the health of those animals? In some of that, there's evidence of behavior that in humans we would use to understand theory of mind and development of mind. And so I'm looking at those and trying to see, do we see that evidence in there? The photographs I have are really only in the postnatal site, where there's a lot of engagement going on for several months between the parents and the family and the young. What's strange about all of that is it does come back to something that I didn't think had much application, had great benefit to me as a learning experience, but at the time didn't think it had relevance to what I was pursuing, which is now play in coyotes, the fundamental thing that I'm looking at to understand the impacts that we have on the quality of life that these animals have.
I think it brings up some issues around traditional wildlife management and just viewing these animals as numbers. there is a science too. We know that these are socially complex, intelligent animals that live in these complex social units and experience emotion. And none of that is really considered. And I think that's something that is really needed in management reform. In these considerations, the science, as Paul always likes to say, like the science can tell us what we can do, but it doesn't necessarily give us permission to do these things. Of course, we can radio collar and kill a staggering number of wolves and maybe see some kind of result from that. But ethically, we need to consider these individual animals and the impact, not just on the numbers. These animals might be resilient in terms of their population, but we have to look at different levels, whether it be pack level, individual level, and those can have so many leading effects to future populations and individuals.
This is not my research, but research that's been done in the United States with coyotes specifically, with wolves in other contexts. Essentially, who that individual is that you remove is very important. When you're dealing with an animal that's a social animal and depends heavily on that social hierarchy and knowledge transfer across generations, if you remove a key individual, you take that knowledge fabric, that fabric apart. What that shows up as in the research that's been done is when you break apart those families, indiscriminately remove individuals, they will rebound, but the conflict and the chances of these animals behaving in a way we don't want them to, for example, higher levels of predation on livestock, those things increase as a result of that change. The research has looked at, really, it looks at those numbers and it's related to the social breakdown. And what matters about that social breakdown is who you're taking out. That's one part of it. So if it's indiscriminate, you can take out a key player in that family. Our coyote families have elders, and I watch them train those pups how to negotiate that landscape over the time that they have they're growing. There's this knowledge transfer. Just like with people, if you blew apart the knowledge transfer system and family structures, you're going to have social disorder. That manifests itself by more younger coyotes in those types of social carnivores, more fragmented groups of individuals, more reproduction. They will repopulate back to the population that they had before that's supportable in the landscape, but that knowledge has been lost. And then embedded in that is the physical trauma, the physical and mental trauma. We measure these things really only physically so far with social carnivores. They have elevated stress levels. Do they move less? Do they have shrunken home ranges? Are they doing things that imply that they've been negatively affected? We use those physical indicators, but those are in humans, those are indicators of trauma or changes in behavior associated with trauma. There's that other layer of it. And the most, I think, heinous part of what I see going on, the most heinous part to me is the use of these animals, the so-called Judas animal. To me, this is where radio coloring has gone to such a grotesque place. An animal is radio colored and then it's followed to its family and its family is killed. And it gets to watch that happen. And then it's followed to the next family that it sets up and so on. It becomes the wolf that betrays its family. People will argue, oh, this is just an emotional argument. Well, two things to say to that. One is that we make no ethical decisions without having an emotional capacity. We must have emotions to make ethical decisions based on science. That point is really moot. I'm not sure why it keeps coming up. The second part to that is there is evidence in so many other species, particularly in those species like in Africa that have been through wars and that are studied and rescued, and the elephants, as you've worked with, that bear the signs of trauma. The same indicators that we use to diagnose trauma in human beings are evident in those animals. It's not a point of debate anymore. To me, this is the most heinous thing that we do. Killing them all indiscriminately, that's got its own serious ethical issues. But the way in which that's engaged and the fact that people can turn a blind eye to it in the name of science and objectivity, this is no longer a subject of debate that there is such a thing as epigenetics. We know that in livestock, we know that in other species, we know that in ourselves. What we do to that one generation will manifest itself down the way, in addition to the individual trauma that's happening there. We don't have to look very far in human history to understand that science, divorced from emotion and ethical considerations, is not, as Paul says, it is not the whole picture. You have to reflect on what you're doing. Our understanding of what we are willing to tolerate happening to humans or animals as a result of science, it morphs over time. We always have to be revisiting that. But again, it's taking that science and putting into the context of society, of right and wrong, of what is moral and what we are willing to to tolerate, that's what allows us to do things properly. And this type of science that's allowing that kind of thing to go on is devoid and divorced from those considerations.
I know that Diane was another female wolf that you tracked. What was so special about her story?
I didn't really know the history of what was going on. I just knew there was this area that had a rendezvous site. There were puppies there, and they wanted to know if those puppies were still alive. Paul tasked me with taking out the big truck, and the government truck is sitting on the side of the road just off the Trans-Canada in Banff and watching this big empty space. I think maybe it was a test of whether I would be able to do field work or not, but it was hours and hours and watch. It was nothing, keep watching through the binoculars. And several hours in, I was like, I'm starting to get uncomfortable. So I shifted. I was sitting on top of the roof of the truck, so I had a good vantage. And I shifted, and the old truck, it went boonk. It sunk in, the roof sunk in. And at that noise, about 100 meters away or 120 meters away, these 5 puppies just popped up out of the grass. And I was like, oh my God, right? So this is like the first wolves I'd ever seen, right? And so I got the observation, I took it all to watch for a little bit, and then I drove like a maniac back to tell Paul. Basically, I was out there watching for these pups to figure out if they had survived, because Diane had been kicked out of the family the year before. She was last seen like about 200 kilometers away, or last seen on the radio telemetry, picked up about 200 kilometers away. They found the lactating female of the Bow Valley pack dead on the highway. They know that obviously she has the pups, they're there. What was amazing about that was that within 2 days of them finding her, Diane showed up back in the valley. The question was, had these pups actually survived? One thing was Diane had returned in 2 days, and she'd been on her own for ages. Question of how she got there, how she knew to come back, that still remains unanswered. And I think it's one of those things helps us understand there's so much we don't know about these animals. But the second part of it was, did the pups survive? And so I was there just to get an observation. So I got the first observation, which meant that they did survive. At the time when that female was killed, those pups were still dependent on that mother for her milk. And so it meant that the only way that they had survived, because they were so young, the only way that they had survived was if Diane had started lactating, so spontaneously lactating. There had been some discussion that does happen in social canids. Between Diane returning from hundreds of kilometers away with no idea how that happened, and the fact that she would have stepped in that role, returned and became the breeding female for the next several years. So it's just these fantastic things that we still don't really understand. So much more to learn.
There's so many cool examples of that. It makes me think of this elephant story, this book, The Elephant Whisperer, actually, of that kind of unknown communication where these elephants would always come and greet this guy when he flew into the reserve. One day he just missed his flight, and his wife said the elephants were making their way up the hill, and then it was like the moment his flight changed, they just all of a sudden turned around and left. And it's like this kind of sense of communication or something that we just will never really understand. Like, we don't know if that's something that happened with Diane and the pack, if they were communicating. Just kind of shows that there's a lot that we don't know and we might never know.
Animals, including human animals, have these capacities, but they've become truncated in some way in people at the expense of whatever else it is. And then we look at these things that we call intuition and we label them as something, because we can't understand and we can't measure them. We sort of label them as non-existent or things that aren't grounded in reality. These are the evidence in our other animal kin. These types of things probably do exist in some level. How we understand that or how that happens in the human context, we don't really know. How you explain that long distance communication, there's something happening there. And just because we can't measure it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right?
What has working with wolves and coyotes or other canid species taught you about yourself?
I don't know so much that I've reflected to say what it's taught me about myself, but it's shaped who I am. It's shaped how I understand behavior amongst people. They've taught me skills that have carried me through certain types of traumatic events. If I look at it, I'm a more compassionate person for having known and worked with them. I'm a more inclusive person that way. It's forced me to look at some of my own frailties around how people perceive me because of being a female in that environment and how that's affected me. You know, my relationship to those animals, the individuals that I've encountered over time, it's just changed who I am in the world. It informs everything I see, and that spills over from animals into people. And people have told me I'm more like a canid than person sometimes in the way I'll carry myself or react. I suppose maybe there's some truth in that. Things you don't realize you've internalized. Somebody said that once to me when I was working with horses. My body language was predatory. They fundamentally changed who I am in the world.
As a final question for young women and girls who might be listening and are interested in pursuing a career in canid research or wildlife research more broadly, I wonder if you could share a bit about any advice you might have for them.
Watch for the doors that are opening, critically evaluate the risks and benefits associated with it, and be comfortable with taking some of those risks to move forward if they're within reason. Persistence is the big one, though, knowing that if you want it, you can do it. You have to put the work into it. You have to recognize the doors that are opening, recognize the opportunities that are presenting themselves to you and pursue those. But also, I think that if you can dream it, you can do it. There's so much to be done, and we need multiple lenses on that. The female perspective, I think, on these things is really critical. If that's what you want to pursue it. You're going to get there. But you really have to work. It doesn't come for nothing. You show up on time. You respect the information of the person who's been doing it for longer. You consider that and question it and have those dialogues, and don't be afraid to challenge how people see things and believe in what you're seeing. If just because you've learned in some class that this is how the relationships are supposed to be, but you're seeing something completely different, well, stick with that and interrogate it. Pushes back on something that's the result of one lensed way of looking at things. So having those multiple perspectives in there is going to be really critical for conservation.
Well, thank you so much, Shelley, for being here today and chatting with us. I'm super excited for everyone to listen to all your stories, and thanks again.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Chelsea. That was fun.
I want to acknowledge that this episode was hosted and recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
This series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger, a passionate field biologist, friend, and source of inspiration to many within Raincoast and beyond. Raincoast Radio is hosted by Chelsea Greer and produced by me, Sophia Osborne, with additional audio editing by Omar Salafu. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.